Bonjour Lionel, bonjour Hippolyte.
Hello Lionel, hello Hippolyte. There's also Christian. As you know, we're going to face a period of strong economic decline. And so, as we can imagine, issues of recovery policies around the world. The fundamental question is really, what are we going to do to try to address, but not whether these stimulus packages are effective or not. Generally, that is not the problem. Whether these stimulus packages have a positive or negative impact on the generations that make up society, whether they will not accentuate the loss of well-being that societies experience, for example in France, where we will say a word about the youth. So in fact, the title of this whole day could have been Economic Decline and Loss of Well-being, and our objective is to reflect on how the economic policy positions taken do not aggravate the differences between the ones and the others, between the generations, but instead try to make them convergent, get closer. There will be, first, a presentation by Mr. Miyamoto, who is a professor, since he deals with the multiplier linked to recovery policies in aging societies. The subject is to reflect on how stimulus policies affect different generations and how one can try to avoid a sort of excessive intergenerational tension. We can take the example of the circle of economists who worked last Thursday on the problem of youth, and we will see how much the fundamental problems, for example, the acceleration of poverty due to the decline of growth or the deceleration, and therefore linked to the pandemic, can actually cause tensions I would define as totally uncontrollable. Well, then if you can put on Mr. Miyamoto, I have the impression that Mr. Miyamoto will speak. Aging economies may benefit less from fiscal stimulus. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Hiroaki, Tokyo Metropolitan University, and I was former economist in International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Thank you very much for having me today. It is my great pleasure to join this roundtable. So today I'm going to present my work on population aging and fiscal policy. This is my joint work with Jiro Honda in the IMF. So as we know, population aging proceeds in the world. So please look at this chart. That chart shows the evolution of old age dependency ratios. The old age dependency ratio is a ratio of people 65 and older to those between 15 and 64 years old. The old age dependency ratio is often used as a measure of population aging. So as you can see from this chart, in the last few decades, old age dependency ratios have been rising. In 2020, Japan has the highest old age dependency ratio, which is around 40%. And according to United Nations, old age dependency ratio in Japan is expected to increase to around 70% by 2050. But you can see that not only Japan, other countries, Korea and China and Europe and the US will face population aging in next few decades. So now population aging is a problem for all countries. So given this fact, the impact of population aging on the economy is discussed both in academia and among the policymakers. And the increasing number of studies have examined the macroeconomic implication of population aging. These studies mainly focus on the impact of population aging on economic growth, consumption, saving, as well as fiscal, because population aging is related to pension system, healthcare system, so on and so forth. So they are related to fiscal. However, little attention has been paid to the impact of population aging on the effectiveness of fiscal policy. So we don't know much about how population aging affects the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. So this study fills this gap by empirically exploring the effect of fiscal spending shock on the output in aging and non-aging economy. So since time is limited, I will not go into the details of our methodology, but we estimated the impact of government spending shock on the output by using panel data of OECD countries. And what we found is that the population aging weakens the effect of fiscal spending shock to boost the output. So this chart shows the result of our analysis. We estimated the effect of fiscal stimulus in both aging and non-aging economies. Now, in this chart, you can see two colors of bars, blue bars and orange bars. Blue bars shows the effect of fiscal stimulus in non-aging economies. On the other hand, orange bars show the effect of fiscal stimulus in aging economies. And we consider two cases. First one is the effect of fiscal stimulus on impact. On impact means we look at the effect of fiscal policy shock when shock takes place. And the light, these bars on right-hand side shows the effect of fiscal stimulus 4 years after the shock. And if you compare blue bars and orange bars, it is clear that the blue bars are much larger than orange bars. That means fiscal stimulus in non-aging economies are larger than those in aging economy. In other words, population aging weakens the effectiveness of fiscal policy. So we also check whether our main result hold when we take into account the states of the economy or states of business cycle. So according to recent literature of the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus, it is known that the effect of fiscal stimulus depends on the state of business cycle. So more precisely, the effect of fiscal stimulus during recessions are more likely to be higher than those during booms. So we check whether we can get a similar result in aging economy. And what we found is the following. Both in non-aging economy and aging economies, the effect of fiscal stimulus during recessions are much higher than those in booms. Moreover, we found that in recessions, the effect of fiscal stimulus in non-aging economy is higher than those in aged economy. So in other words, even we control the state of business cycle, we can still find that the population aging reduces the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. So next, I would like to talk about the possible channels of transmissions. We found that population aging reduces or weakens the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. The question is how? And we find that in the aging economies, responses of private consumption and the employment to the fiscal stimulus becomes weak. This is the main reason why we have lower impact of fiscal stimulus in aging economy. So key is responses of employment and private consumptions. So finally, let me summarize our findings and discuss some policy implications. So we found that population aging weakens the effectiveness of fiscal policies. So given this, we have three policy implications. First one, so in order to support aggregate demand during recession in aged economy, we may need larger fiscal stimulus. This is because in the aged economy, the impact of fiscal stimulus becomes weak. So we need larger fiscal stimulus. However, to conduct such a larger fiscal stimulus, we need to secure sufficiently large fiscal space or fiscal room during booms. Otherwise, it creates some concern for fiscal sustainability. The last point is that since the output effect of fiscal stimulus becomes smaller in the aged economy, other economic policies, including structural reform, would play more important role in supporting domestic demand. And we think some policy measure to enhance labor supply would increase the effect of fiscal stimulus. This is because the reason why fiscal stimulus becomes weak, the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus weak in the aged economy is lower labor forces. So therefore, some measure to enhance labor supply could help to restore or increase the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. So that's all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me today. It is my great honor to be here. And this is my email address. So if you have comments or suggestions or questions, please feel free to send email to me. And my presentation today is based on my paper with Mr. Honda in the IMF. So you can find the original paper in the IMF website. And also, we have one article in the IMF blog. So if you are interested, please visit these two websites. Thank you very much.
Société vieillissante est moins rapide à réagir.
An aging society is slow to respond to stimulus policies. Our subject is the question of whether, for example, the recovery policy that was announced in France, the 100 billion that have been announced and which should develop. Remember that there's about 7 billion devoted to youth. Will these stimulus policies not tend to spread declines in well-being or reinforce declines in well-being for the younger generation? You remember that a few days ago we questioned ourselves about the problem, really I'd say, of the so-called sacrificed generation. Remember that there is this debate amongst the youth saying, basically, we are sacrificed to protect older people's health. So there are all these issues that are obviously at the heart of the difficulties of our society's functioning, and this is about what, I suppose, if you agree, we will talk. Knowing that these are difficult, touchy subjects, I suggest that Christian should start on that theme. We'll then go around the table, reformulate questions, debate, and we will conclude that stimulus policies in reality increase the gap of well-being decline between generations. Bonjour, Président. Dear friends, hello. I'm a little less severe than you on our Japanese friend's paper, because I think it covers one aspect of the subject, but one aspect only. And listening to him, I wanted to dig further. So maybe that's information you have at the chair and I don't. I mean, we need to revise life cycle models, and I think we need to refine them. So it has been done for 30 years, well after the works of Modigliani and others. But in relation to the efficiency of the stimulus according to the age groups that benefit from the injected purchasing power, because that is the subject. When following a Keynesian perspective, the perspective of demand, I would be interested. So it is a question I ask you and the people of the chair. Do you have precise information, possibly panel data, on the evolution of the willingness to save for senior citizens. They are the 60 to 80-year-old who, in my opinion, continue to save quite a lot because they have a relatively high life expectancy, and then they are the 80 to 100-year-old who, if I may say, in my opinion, have a more limited life expectancy, who consume. So we have to bring to light what does not appear in the article of our Japanese friend. We have to bring to light, in my opinion, the category of elders, as we say in the Caribbean, into several subcategories. The mechanisms would be clearer at that point, I think. So, I'm coming back to the heart of the debate. That is the recovery policies that have been put in place since spring. There is, by the way, an overlapping between support and recovery, and there are measures which concern both, i.e., there is fire in the house, it has to be extinguished. So hundreds of thousands of billions of euro are injected massively. And then there is the stimulus that prepares for the rebound in potential growth in the medium and long term. The horizons are not the same, but I think there is an overlap. I would like to mention 3 points. The first, which you mentioned in your introduction, is to say that this health, economic and social crisis, which is not over, has 3 main consequences on the social fabric. An increase in unemployment, this part-time unemployment, an increase in inequality, and an increase in poverty. On the issue of unemployment, you talked about young people. Madame Elisabeth Born says that the youth plan that has been put in place already translates into hundreds of thousands of hires. We'll see. There's the issue of hiring, there's the issue of income too, and the issue of purchasing power of the young generations. What strikes me when we take France as an example, where, as you know, we have issues of unemployment at the 2 ends of the string, that is, for young people and those over age of 50 or 55. The stimulus package that has been put in place in France is aiming to curb the rise in youth unemployment with, in my opinion, an efficiency that will be limited and that will, I think, reinforce the issue of intergenerational conflict. The youth unemployment rate in France, well before COVID, has always been, for 30 years, more than 2 times higher than the overall unemployment rate. My analysis is that with the current crisis we may be moving towards a multiplier of youth unemployment that will stand at 3 or higher than 3. And that reinforces both intergenerational inequality and potential generational conflicts. On the question of inequality-poverty, I am struck, when looking at recent developments in France, by the public coming to the restaurants du cœur, who are clearly facing poverty, if not even great poverty. There are more and more young people, students, representing an increasing percentage of this population. So we really need to do field studies, which I have not done, to see if there is any distortion of the age pyramid in the population visiting the Restaurant du Cœur. For example, maybe you have done this study at the chair, but I don't have it in mind. So these are the projects we need to work on. A second point linked to the stimulus packages is the question of innovation. For me, this is a complicated subject, that is to link the age pyramid and the desire to innovate. Because in our mind, the Schumpeterian entrepreneur is a rather young person who has a low risk aversion. Both the panel colleagues and the chair's experts, do you have any study at hand on the degree of risk aversion according to age groups? I insist. In our minds, I repeat, in our minds, the Schumpeterian entrepreneur is the young business school graduate, or not graduate. Look at what happened in the new economy, Anyway, it's rather young people who took the risk of the GAFA, all of these new economies. I think there's a topic here that is a big part of the French stimulus package, of the European stimulus package, and the EIB funding go through the innovation channel in its broadest sense. New technologies, new products, new forms of organizations. I think we have to come back to a definition of innovation in the Schumpeterian sense. For Schumpeter, there were 5 senses. Here I take 3: technology, product, and organization. And it is clear that we are far from succeeding. If I look at what is happening on localization through innovation, for example, the work of Philippe Aghion and colleagues, the European Recovery Plan of 750 billion, finally adopted, that goes mainly through innovation, research, etc. It seems to me that it is not all guaranteed that the targeted populations are the ones that will exactly innovate. Are we not giving incentives to populations or to groups of the population that are maybe not less capable of innovation, but perhaps most hesitant, or showing aversion to risks different from the population that might be more interesting to target? Finally, because I do not want to be too long, stimulus packages have an ecological dimension and link ecology and economy more than before, which was not very challenging. In the end, the whole debate is to study the ability to project oneself in the long term, according to age. It is clear that I am not a youngster, I am a professor emeritus, so imagine that my time horizon is by definition shorter than the one of a young teacher of 30 years. I would like there to be studies, you might answer that they exist, but I don't know them, studies that measure the degree of preference for the present. The same is the degree of depreciation of the future, as measured by the so-called discount rate. Try to measure the degree of preference for the present and depreciation of for the future according to the age of the people concerned. Perhaps one would find paradoxes. Perhaps 70-year-old people, given the increase in life expectancy, will have an ability to project themselves 20 or 30 years into the future, which is as much as others. That is empirical work, it is panel data, but I still think this is very important in order to know how much the measures of the French and European stimulus packages, articulated around ecological objectives, which are long-term objectives, organized around sustainable development objectives, around the rise of ESG criteria, of the extra-financial in our societies, in the life of companies, in the life of institutions. To what extent the acceptability by the society of these new extra-financial criteria, which involves thinking in the long term, to what extent this acceptability is modified or not modified, and if it is modified, in what sense, through the aging of the population. Those are a few thoughts, by the way. Thank you for your time. Thank you very much, Christian. Maybe just a comment. What you said makes it very clear that the stimulus packages, I think we all know about them more or less, we all have looked at them, do not really show the intergenerational dimension. And I have liked the idea that you differentiate between the support plans and the stimulus packages. The support part is predominant and will become more and more predominant. Yesterday, Madame Elisabeth Born discovered that the forecasts for the unemployment rate at the end of 2021 would be in the order of 10.5 to 10.6, which means 1 million more unemployment people. She has discovered that. She announces some exceptional news, but obviously that doesn't match with the reality. It is undoubtedly and by its nature a problem that is likely to affect quite massively young people, more than pensioners, as well as the working people. So we will see this malaise once again. That is why the word well-being exasperates me. This decline in well-being will affect all of our societies for several years, and it will particularly affect the younger populations. We will also see that there will be a reaction to this, because it is them who will react in the coming months. But the first phase is a phase that does not take into account the intergenerational. So Hippolyte, if you would also give us your feeling about this theme that you know particularly well. Thank you, Jean-Hervé. Thank you to the chair for giving me the opportunity to speak. I would just like to first react to one of the points raised by Christian to try to do something a little dynamic. Christian, you said the Schumpeterian entrepreneur in some ways is not old, so he or she is young. And it is clear that historically we are rather going to see that. But when one actually thinks about the innovation process today, or when one looks at it specifically, one no longer finds a Schumpeterian entrepreneur. Innovation is a quite complex process, but involves a lot of people. It is really the idea of a cluster. We innovate in places where there are many people working on innovation. And so, the age dimension may seem less relevant than in the past. It really is Silicon Valley that innovates, or perhaps Saclay, or so on. And so, we need the long-term projection of younger generations, but we also need the knowledge of the past to pass it on to this younger generation. And I think that this opposition, in fact, between the youngest and the oldest is not necessarily relevant today in the context of innovation. Because a young person who is eager and has plenty of time in front of him, etc., can be as intelligent as he wants. If he is not in this place where there is the memory of research today, it must be acknowledged that all the accumulation of knowledge that was produced during the 20th century is immense. A young, intelligent, innovative, etc. person can get lost very quickly. So he needs to be guided and needs to express his talent precisely from this intergenerational link, and I think it is an important dimension of relations between people. Now, on the more specific issue of this stimulus package, indeed, there are measures. Roughly 6 billion for young people, and there's everything else. And all the rest is aimed at boosting future economic growth, and so in fact, if it works, there will be a positive impact on today's young people, who will be just a little less young tomorrow. And I am not so sure that opposing the 6 billion and the other 94 billion is necessarily relevant. Nevertheless, and I think that finally the presentation made by the IMF person is interesting. The idea, beware this traditional stimulus, which is not necessarily targeted at young people, will not work or be all the more effective if you are in a society that has not aged. And I urge to take into account precisely when building a new stimulus package, when putting a lot of money on the table, to also take into account an intermediate objective of efficiency if we want society to be young in a way. So, on the question of what a young society is, what a dynamic society is, more than demographic criteria, I am merely interested in the proportion of working people. It is quite simple. There are finally two types of people in society. There are those who work, who contribute, agreed, whether in the commercial or in the non-commercial sector. I'm taking a very broad definition. There are those who work, who contribute to the society, which can be in innovation, for example, but not only, it can be in care, etc. And those who do not work. And what we observe is that the greater the proportion of people who work, who contribute is in society, the more dynamic it is, agreed? And that is why I think it is very good to take into account environmental objectives, etc. But I think we must not forget this dimension of contribution to the effort of the community. I won't be too long, because I think we stop at 10:30. I think there are three dimensions to be taken into account in a stimulus package that must be absolute. First is women's employment, which is still today, there's still a reserve. If I may say, a labor reserve, as it was called at the time, employment rates are 10 percentage points lower than those of men. So any recovery policy must ask itself how it can also promote access and involvement of these people. There are a lot of things, fiscal incentives, etc., but also in the economic sectors. There's the employment of senior citizens. Christian, you mentioned it. It goes up since the years of 2000. This is good news, but is still very weak. In France, the 55 to 64-year-old are about 50% of the working people. It is ridiculous. We are amongst the lowest of all our partners. Countries like Germany, Japan, Sweden, 70%. I think on the question of pensions reform, which will return, I think we should not simply focus on the notions of simplicity, fairness, broad principles, but also put the issue of the work of the senior citizens at the heart of the process. And then, the last dimension is what I will call imported work. That is immigration, which is also a source of regeneration of our economies. It should be understood that in most rich countries the demographic dynamism comes from immigration, much more than from birth. In any case, the migratory balance is higher than the natural balance, France being an exception. Today, in France, we have a working immigration, but which is essentially a very particular immigration. It is posted work. We were not far from 250,000 people before the crisis. It causes social dumping, and it is strongly increasing. So in fact, we rely on this very particular form of work because there are needs. Hence, I advocate for a more sustainable immigration and to use the benefits of it for integration. Thank you. Just one thing, Hippolyte. I am very much in agreement with what you said about the stimulus packages. But when you look at the French 100 billion, first of all, it's not 100 billion. You have to remove 10 billion various that have not been spent. The reality is still different. Almost 55% is support to the insiders, rightly so. And the insiders are active, not young people. So perhaps we will come back to the problem of education of young people for the conclusion. Very clearly, partial unemployment is a support to the insiders. The fact that we do not touch pensions is a support to the insiders. In terms of the money allocated to insiders, it is lower for all people who are in precarious employment and, in particular, for young people, who are proportionately more numerous in this sector. But I do not know if this is necessarily the right approach to compare billions. The question is whether every euro is effective or well spent. Thank you, Jean-Hervé. Much has been well said, so I will be quick too. I have actually reread the government stimulus plan to prepare for this session, through the eye of the intergenerational issue. And there is something surprising. The senior citizens are really the most overlooked ones of the stimulus package. Is this surprising? I'd say yes and no. Most overlooked because I have done some research and the item senior citizens appears only twice in all the documents and appears only in the environmental chapter for help to renovate housing for the senior citizens. I mean thermal rehabilitation. So clearly, if a choice was made, it is the choice of youth, since youth is the most important part of the social cohesion. And I think rightly. I thought it is important to understand that this stimulus package is not like the others. We have had plenty of stimulus packages in the past. I think of the early 80s, when we had typical Keynesian stimuli, because the economic machine that was really idling. It is very different here, because we are tackling a crisis that is not a crisis as we experienced in the late 70s or in the 80s. It is a voluntary crisis. We voluntarily put whole parts of the economy to rest, to limit the mobility of people. So the stimulus package is not about addressing economic problems, that is, a malfunctioning of the economy. And it is clearly perceived as such. It is not trying to boost private consumption, because it has been deliberately limited. and it is hoped that it will restart normally, as it should have continued to function. The hope is that households will not keep their savings rates as high as they currently are, but which are mainly forced savings. It is not a stimulus package like the others, as we tended to know them. We don't have to look at the Keynesian multiplier here. The stimulus package is finally a pretext. Economic activity must be revived, and it will restart on its own once unbridled. It still leaves damage, it leaves traces, so you need to accompany it. But it is clear that in this stimulus package, as said by Jean-Hervé, is a European stimulus package. The French stimulus plan fits perfectly into the European stimulus package. It is not unique to France. It incorporates the main elements that have been defined at European level and is fully articulated with the German stimulus package. The same sectors are targeted. And what is finally being sought? It is to tackle the structural aspects. In this sense, it is very different from the stimulus packages, which are usually very cyclical. The big structural issues are addressed, and within lie the three big transitions: the energy and the environmental transition, the first environmental component here, where we put all into really try to move forward mainly on the energy transition rather than the environmental transition. Transition that has been called innovation and so on, which I call digital transition. It is a rather major change that is now being implemented with this breakthrough in the digital economy. We know that Europe is lagging behind, so the stimulus plan is aimed at trying to partly catch up. And then, somewhere behind, the third part of social cohesion is addressing the demographic transition. But it addresses it by targeting, in quotes, those who are the victims. And very clearly, beyond the COVID, beyond the health crisis, those are the young. I said that surprisingly, the senior citizens are the most overlooked ones. They only appear twice in the energy rehabilitation, but that is somewhat intentional. When asking who are the ones that will be affected by the COVID crisis, these are mainly young people. I mean, of course, besides the health aspect. Mainly young people through the economic crisis, and they are doubly affected because this demographic transition is also relatively unfavorable to young people. That is, in short, my point of view. So, it is not to define what the best stimulus package would be, it has already been defined by the government, but to see some coherence at that level. Thank you. I'd like to finish by saying that on the missed opportunities, it seems to me for the moment, since I am an optimist, we have a problem of education in our country. I am not obsessed with the idea of whether we are more or less good in maths and geography on the basis of surely questionable research, but much more so, as Nathalie Chusseau said yesterday in a debate, with the figure of the 140,000 young people that have dropped out, becoming completely desocialized out of the school or university system every year. That is still absolutely gigantic. And then basically, beyond geography or mathematics, the idea that it is a society that needs to have a lot of self-confidence, that our entire educational system is not a system that gives self-confidence. But I finish on a very good news anyway. Beyond the fact that the stimulus package is not very favorable to young people for the moment, we will see how it evolves after the social movements that will take place next year. There's this EIDLL poll that has been used during our Circle of Economists Day last Thursday. The 18 to 24-year-olds say they were convinced that they were a sacrificed generation, but convinced that they would make it through and that they would do it on their own. I found this absolutely wonderful. And I thought it was a feature of French society, a kind of resilience. That is, when you really are in trouble, at that time the temperament of strength and strength of character emerges. Thank you very much, and my dear colleagues, and I hand the floor back to the chair.